Hello, beautifuls. You are listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Vanessa Scotto, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and co-host, Brooke Thomas. On the show, we're talking about being on the embodied spiritual path. And what does that actually mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything? All the beauty and crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life. We're always attempting to sort that out for ourselves here on the show, and we're always glad you're listening in. A few weeks back, we spoke about relationships with a spiritual twist, and we realized afterwards that no episode on love could be complete without also speaking to heartbreak. Ultimately, we all want to feel connected, and yet the fear of feeling heartbreak can be so fundamental that we wind up creating obstacles to the very love we desire. So in this week's episode, we're looking at how to recover from the loss of a relationship. From knowing your own resiliency to releasing old pain from your body that leaves you unable to tolerate more tension, to learning how to actually receive from a support system, we're exploring how we can heal a broken heart. If you're enjoying the show, we'd be delighted if you went ahead and left us a review on iTunes or even on our Facebook page, which is Bliss and Grit. You can also head over to blissandgrit.com and subscribe to hear updates on the upcoming events we'll have very soon in the future. One last note before we head into the conversation, just in case you're new to the show, Brooke and I have potty mouths, so please feel free to pop in some headphones if there are kids around. All right, here we go. Hey, Brooke.
Hey, Hermana. For all you Arrested Development people out there. Wink.
Wink, wink. All right, here's what's on the agenda for this episode. Okay, a couple of weeks ago, we did an episode on love and relationships. Hopefully, you all had a chance to listen to that one. And it occurred to Brooke and I as we got to the end of our social media engagement on the topic that we never really talked about heartbreak and what to do if you open up to someone and it doesn't go the way that you dreamed of. I guess when you boil it down, Brooke, you and I are very much just about being present and connected to this world and to one another, right? I mean, if I could put words in our mouth, our biggest concern is disembodiment and disconnection. And I think that, is it fair for me to say that you and I both believe that were you to tune in and just be present, love is there? Do you believe that?
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
So then we have to start asking ourselves, like, what's the problem? Why aren't we all just in a mad love fest with each other?
Yeah.
Right? It's like if we're so realized, actually I posted a quote today on Instagram. It was Eckhart Tolle quote, but it was something like, you become realized when you realize that you're already realized, it's one of those kinds of.
One of those jobbies.
Wake up, you're ready to be the fuck you're supposed to be and just realize that shit and the world will be great. Well, if that's the case, then what's the problem here? Why aren't we all like in a love puddle? And why instead, if you're in America, why the fuck are you in the middle of a hate bubble, right? That's bubbling up all around us. Mm-hmm. So, got us thinking about that. And as we got towards the end of the week, we realized that we talked about love. We talked about falling in love with a spiritual twist and all that, but we never really touched on heartbreak. And I think heartbreak, the fear of living with a broken heart, the fear of living with loss, the fear of all the narratives that get stirred when something doesn't go as you had dreamed is so big. It's so, I guess, core to the ego. It's core to our survival system. It's so primal in that wiring that people create obstacles to that experience of love, right? They throw up blockades. They create restrictions so that it's hard to be present. It's hard to be inextricably connected. And it's hard to just open to love. So I thought today it would be useful if we talk about how we can really interact with heartbreak, from a, from our experience, and also maybe a little bit from a spiritual perspective.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things we were talking about before we hopped on for our official recording session is how intricate the process of healing from heartbreak is. And I would say how much it permeates life. It's just a part of life. Like, it's an ongoing process. It's very acute when we have an actual, like, let's say a relationship ends, and it can be acute for some period of time, months or years. But I would say that, like, disentangling our defense mechanisms about heartbreak is really quite the journey. It's an ongoing process. And one of the things, I'll just take words out of your mouth and apply them here. You were saying, like, there are all these spiritual platitudes, which are true, like, just love yourself, like, and you're already home or whatever. That's true. Forgiveness. But it's very individual and nuanced and complex to take the inner dive to discover these things. And I would say that we all absolutely, 100% of us probably have, or at least 99.9% of us have given our hearts in a love relationship, and it did not go the way we expected it would or hoped it would, because that's just a part of being human, and it's a part of the maturation process. You have your first crush at age 12, and you have these fantasies about how it's going to go or whatever, and that doesn't work out, up to major heartbreak as an adult, or divorce, or all of these things. And the mechanisms that we block ourselves from future love, or the ways that we can't see the defense mechanisms that we're putting in place for the heartbreak, these things are all happening at the unconscious level. We're not making decisions about how to cut ourselves off from love for the future. And we're not making decisions in our current love relationships to erode those based on programming about avoiding heartbreak. So I'm just saying that as like let's start with the understanding that A, this is complex, nuanced, and a lifelong process. And B, there's no shame involved, because we all do it, and we all do it at an unconscious level. But we want to bring it up to consciousness as much as we can in all of its different layers and manifestations, so that we can have different experiences and not just keep running the same program.
I think there was even a time where I did do it consciously. Like a lot of our programming and conditioning is so unconscious. It's like maybe you were 7 and your parents broke your heart by not witnessing you for the real human being that you were. Or, kids at school made fun of you and your heart got broken, because our heart gets broken all over the place by all sorts of different relationships. And that kind of goes into your coding, so to speak, so that you curl your shoulders forward and you hide who you really are. So there's that very unconscious level that you were getting at, Brooke. And then I feel like right after I got a divorce, I always use these words. They just came to me at that time, given what I was going through, and seems relevant a lot of times when I talk to clients. I had what I called heart fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean.
I cannot. It was like, I just felt like, not again. Like, I'm just not going to do it. I just do not have the energy left to put my heart out there and get hurt. And it really felt quite conscious, actually, on my part. Like, I was like, I'm not going to fall in love again. And that's it. I mean, I was 33. It's kind of crazy to look back, because 33 is quite a mature woman, really. I'm 43 now, but I'm like, I look back at that person and I'm like, what was I deciding there? But the way I saw it was like, you know what? I should just have sex with a lot of different people and, ride motorcycles and drink tequila and not give a shit about the world.
Right.
That's kind of how my inner personality goes. And so I feel like on that level, I was quite aware. But the interesting thing was, And I did date a lot of people, and I was kind of just maybe for a year or more, quite guarded, like really guarded against hurt. I just wouldn't soften to people. I just wouldn't let them in. And I was dating someone at the time who later became my boyfriend, a more serious relationship. And he was like one of many to me. It's really how I felt, like stone cold defense. I liked him, but it was like stony. And he was having dinner with me, and he kind of looked at me and he was like, Vanessa, at some point, I'm going to get serious about someone. He was dating other people too. And he's like, and it would just be so sad if it wasn't you. And out of his eye springs a tear, like one tear. And Brooke, swear to God, I felt something crack open in my chest, like a literal physical pop feeling. And I started bawling. And that was it. The doors opened. The dam opened. I couldn't have planned that. That's the part that wasn't conscious. But so I think there's so many ways that we guard, and it's like quite literal. It's quite somatic, and it's quite narrative driven as well, of course. But there's all these defenses we have to love. And the most sad and frustrating part, I think, for all of us is, what is it that we want more than love?
I know. I'm debating between the Pema Chodron quote and just speaking to that a little bit. So when you were describing this experience, what sprung to mind for me is that I think oftentimes we can know, like you were saying, you were just like, yeah, no, that's not going to happen for me. And actually, you and I got divorced around same time. What were you, a year apart or something? Our divorces?
Yeah,
2 years apart, somewhere in that framework.
2 years, because I was already living in San Francisco a while.
That's right.
Yeah.
And we handled it in the same and in completely different ways. Like you and I both shut our hearts off, and your shut off heart was, I'm going to have sex with tons of people and ride motorcycles and drink tequila.
Please, I hope you're not listening, Mario or my mother.
And my shut off was more like, I'm just dead inside now.
And that's that.
I'm just never going to do this again. So I'm going to focus on, raising my son and earning a living and nourishing relationships with friendships. Yeah. And my work has always been a great love of mine, also a great hiding place. And so I was like, so this is just what I do now. I'm not even going to, I don't even understand why I would even try. For years, I did that for at least 2 years, maybe 3 years. So we both went in the shut off mode. And then what's funny is that even if you know you're doing it consciously, and even if you get to the point where you make a decision, okay, I want to soften this, forgiveness to ourselves, forgiveness to, ex-partners or to the world or whatever goes on, it arises in this funny way. I don't mean to say that in a way like we can't make choices that shape our own healing, because obviously I feel very strongly that we can. But there is something about just that ripening where something kind of cracks open. And the cracking open can often be the thing that shows you the next step in the path that's going to help you with your healing. So it's not so much like something to put on your to-do list, like heal my heart and forgive, because we do that. I think we have that orientation. But the nuance of it, the subtlety of whatever the individual imprint is on you, on the individual person, is going to require a certain kind of intricate excavation process. And for me, one of the heart cracking open moments was actually not in that long single period, but it was, I had one completely catastrophic, disastrous, really toxic, very unwell person relationship after my 2 or 3 years, I can't remember, of being completely shut off. It was like a flamethrower on a dry forest kind of experience. It was not good.
No,
it was not good. And I remember I was working with a therapist after it ended, a trauma therapist. And I didn't start working with her because I was like, I'm traumatized. I was just working with her because I couldn't stop perseverating on it. Like I thought about it all day long, most of the day, mostly in this shame-based, I can't believe I was capable as a 35-year-old woman when I started the relationship of choosing a person like that and then persisting in it for a year, and just like tons and tons and tons of like shame and real shock, real surprise. Like, who is this person that I'm inhabiting that she would make that kind of choice? So I undertook therapy for that. And yet it didn't occur to me what was really going on with me. And like, I'll never forget the moment. It was a crack open moment for me that I was like trying to get her to sort of like point out the thing and then fix it. Like I would go like, oh, okay. And it would just like disappear. And instead I kept describing what I had always described, which was, I'm thinking about this for most of the day, every day. And she just said the two most powerful words anyone's ever said to me in my life. She looked at me and she said, "That's trauma." And somehow in that moment, it made sense to me, like, oh, like my brain is like a car with wheels stuck in the mud, because I had experienced PTSD before when I was younger. And I was like, oh, that's what I'm doing. And suddenly it was like this relief, because I could see that there was this like nervous system wiring that was just like, and it wasn't just shame about me being broken or me making terrible choices or all those things anymore. It was suddenly like, okay, there's this nervous system process going on and it can be repaired. But that was one of those things that just, I was in therapy, like I was doing a lot of things, but it had to kind of emerge.
Yeah. That's what like they call grace, right?
Yeah.
So you can put yourself in the position to receive it, which you do. You read books, you see a therapist, you can talk to wise friends. There's all these things that we can do, meditate to put ourselves in the position. But grace kind of comes when grace comes, right? As these epiphanies do. I was thinking, earlier when you were speaking, about what are the things that kind of break our heart and like, how does that happen? Because, each relationship that I lost was a little different for me. I had a little bit of a different experience, although sometimes the threads were the same. So one of the things that always plagued me after the loss of relationship was my own trance of unworthiness got really loud, right? So that pain body that thinks I'm not lovable gets really loud when you go through heartbreak. And I think I see that pretty commonly. It's like, well, then if this person doesn't love me and this didn't work and they didn't want to stick it out or they didn't improve or they weren't nicer, just like I wanted them to be, whatever the case is, then ipso facto, I am not worthy, just like I feared, or I am not lovable, or I am not valuable, just like I feared. So part of the pain, I think, of heartbreak for me when I go through it. So there's like, okay, so how Buddha would talk about like there's two arrows, like the first arrow is the suffering. Like if you lose someone, there's just grief and you can't control that. But then I'm totally misquoting Buddha, but there's definitely two arrows in this quote. But then there's the second arrow. And the second arrow is the one you shoot yourself. And that's the one you have control over. So grief is nothing to be treated. It's not even really necessary to analyze it. It's just grief. It's pure. I mean, we're meant, like we talked about grief, right? It's pure and it's quite beautiful. It's praise. It's praise to something you love. So that's the first arrow. And there's nothing to be done about that. You just don't turn away. And then there's the second one, which are all the narratives we heap onto the grief. So that's the I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable, I'll never find love, I am specially selected by the universe to never be worthy of love, I'm not going to have a relationship, I'll never live through this, I can't go through this again, I don't possibly have the strength, all of those different storylines and narratives that we can heap on the experience. So part of what was happening for me in heartbreak was the second arrow of me saying, this means I'm not lovable. And this means I won't get love. And that was really dominant in my divorce. I did actually have an epiphany through that, but I want to talk about that later. But the second thing that really came up for me with divorce, I wonder if you had this, Brooke, I don't know, was what I always called the first disillusionment, which was like, I was a pretty aware person. I knew life had suffering and all of that, but I was also a pretty optimistic person. And I had a certain number of like, I'd say idealistic views on life that may not seem so idealistic when I say them out loud, but things like, if you just love someone enough, it works.
Right. Sure. Yes. I think that many of us believed that when we were younger, or at least I certainly did. Yeah.
Some people are still clinging to it. I know because I talk
Sure.
to them.
Sure.
And this idea that like love conquers all. And I really completely like to separate love and relationships. They are not one and the same.
Mm-hmm.
You can love someone and love lasts forever and it can conquer everything. But that doesn't mean a relationship works.
Yeah.
In other words, at its purest, love is unconditional. Relationships are conditional because they are two people with conditions and preferences and narratives and pain bodies connecting with each other. Ipso facto, conditions, my new word of the day. So, you know, I had this idea that like, if you love enough and oh, let's add to it. If I'm good enough and I work hard enough and I'm perfect enough and I try enough, I can make a relationship work, right? Because I watched my parents. They didn't seem to do like a pretty spectacular job as far as my vision of relationships was concerned. And you're like, I don't want to lose hope. So I'm going to just say that if I, Vanessa Scotto, try super hard and I'm really, really, really good and I love with all my being, this shit will work. Mm-hmm. And I'll have this everlasting, beautiful love that's always romantic and always fabulous for the rest of my life. Right. And when it didn't happen, it was a complete shock to my system. And it was the first disillusionment, which I think is really important, actually. I think my best clients are the clients that come to me who've had a disillusionment because of my orientation, where it's like, oh, good, now we're ready to see.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel lucky that mine started pretty young. Like I didn't feel that way then, but it's like, woo, it's so great. You know, now we can get down to some business.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's like kind of waking up in America and like seeing all the toxic hate that was obviously festering underneath the skin, you know, like we kind of knew, but you didn't know the extent of it until it erupted. Right. And it's like, okay, so we have a disillusionment. Like I had not realized a lot of people when Trump got elected and then all the hate crimes started and all that kind of stuff, they're like, what?
Yeah.
Not
We're going to just keep letting someone behave like a dictator in our democratic country. Yes. We're just going to keep letting that happen. Yeah.
It's a disillusionment, but that's good because it wakes you up out of whatever trances and whatever kind of personalized worldview you've been clinging to. And now you see, and from there, you know, things can change. And so I think that when we have heartbreak, some of what we're bumping up against is this isn't how it was supposed to go, right? Like, what is love then? And how does one find love, you know, and how does one keep loving? So I think you have that basic, and then you have your narratives that come into play. And then lastly, and then I'll just stop talking, but I guess it just occurs to me, the last piece that is like right in the front of my mind that we cope with at the end of a relationship is very physical. It's like, can I tolerate in my body, in my soma, this level of pain without turning away?
Yeah.
Because maybe I had never built that capacity. Maybe I've always distracted myself, or maybe life has been really easy on me up until this point, or I don't know. But it's like, do you ever have that fear, Brooke, that something was going to happen and like, if you were to like touch it or acknowledge it or be with it, you would just fall apart?
Yeah, sure. Plenty of times.
Yeah, it's like the fear. I think it's the fear.
I think
we
so
fear
too.
Heartbreak, but why? Because A, we don't like pain, so that's just super simple. But add to that, we think we're going to fall apart, like we're going to lose our shit. You know how many people like may say, I've said it, like put me in a mental institution. Yeah, I'm gone. I'm losing it. Right. So I think that's partly psychological, but partly, do you agree with this? I mean, you're touching people's bodies every day. I feel like Alexandra Lowen used to point to the fact that our body kind of had to tolerate it. Just the same way as ecstasy, like holding joy, holding bliss. these are big emotions. Grief is big.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it's transcendent. So maybe it's that. Grief is transcendent. And I think grief is so big, it can like move through your whole being and it threatens to break apart some of your structuring. And I think both mentally and physiologically, there's a certain preparation for that, or a certain sense of, I need to have some capacity for this.
Yeah. I mean, you're getting at exactly where I want to go with this, because there are certain, like in order to heal this, to heal the heartbreak, and in order to go forward in life and be able to choose and experience a different situation, a different kind of relationship, certain conditions need to be met in order for healing to arise. And I don't mean that in a like the perfect blueprint for everyone kind of way, but I do think that there's an individualized journey for everyone. And so it's probably worth getting into some of what we think, you know, for us, and then also what we've seen for other people, what some of the healthy healing conditions are that people can invite in. Because like we were saying before, you know, grace, those moments, those breaking open epiphany moments, they just arise, but they arise because certain helpful conditions have been invited in. You know, it's like growing something in a garden. You know, the soil has to have certain basic nutrient conditions and sunlight and water in order for anything to grow. So we need to invite in the nourishment. And, you know, the first place that I would go with that is what you were just bringing up, which is, you know, how the body tolerates it. You know, I'm in the very, very beginning of a process of completely changing my private practice because, so I've been a Rolfing practitioner, a manual therapist for 16 years now. And I entered that field. It's so funny because Rolfing helped me to heal from physical issues, but it also helped me to heal from my trauma. And yet I only decided to pay attention to the physical issues part when I entered the field. And so I took on this orientation that pain and mobility problems and physical dysfunction was most of the time, at least the kinds of people who I was seeing in my practice, it was most of the time about tissue damage or alignment problems. And so I was like a mechanic, right, that could fix it up and send people on their way. But, you know, what I've seen for all these many, many years now, and certainly what I encounter in all of the really smart somatic people I talk to on Liberated Body, is that, you know, I was just yet another product of this mind-body divide culture where I decided I'm on team body, you know, and this is what team body needs to get better. But what I see in my clients is that as their body changes, their lives change. And to a certain degree, their personas change. They still are who they are. Their personalities are what they are. But and so frequently in a Rolfing 10 series, people make these big, big life choices to leave a job, to leave a marriage, to, you know, make some major move, all these things. And I think it's because this is how we tolerate pain, emotional pain, is that we do these micro gripping. Like, why do people take on these weird shapes as they age? You know, the person with the chronic grimace or the chronic hunched shoulders or the always tipping forward, you know, it's not always because of like that ski accident. More often than not, it's this accumulation of many years worth of being unable to or uneducated about how to tolerate the emotional processes that are moving through. And so we pretend that, or we believe that our reptilian brain believes that it can defend and protect us by gripping in different ways in the body. And those grips, just like a crappy old house with layers and layers and layers of wallpaper paint, they just keep going and going and going until we can't feel anything in any kind of unfiltered way, and certainly not in any way where our container feels like big and open and juicy and nourishing to be able to deal with them. And one of the great surprises for me of my practice, not because it's not still a challenge, because it is, but like when the big feelings come, and certainly I'm in the midst of a bunch of them right now, as you mentioned, because of the state of the world and who our president is, if I do take the time to drop in and meet them, meaning it's like, I'll do somatic meditation, sensation, body-based meditation, drop in, and then I just kind of go over to the sensation. So let's say it's like a big roiling, uncomfortable feeling in my solar plexus, and I just kind of like, hello. I'm not poking right in the heart of it, but it's like literally feeling it almost from the periphery and getting curious about it and soft about it and compassionate about it, and how much that really does allow that to digest. It helps it to move through. It sounds so simple that, it's not simple, actually. It's quite a learned skill, I'm finding, but it sounds so like, oh, just awareness would help something that feels that awful. And it's like, I find that it does. But it's the willingness. The willingness can be the challenging part.
You have to face the fear. We've come to be afraid of the intensity of our own emotions for various reasons. As you pointed out before, many of them personal, some of them global, just people like you to have your shit together.
Yeah.
So probably at some point in your life, you didn't have your shit together and someone didn't like that. And they pointed it out. And so we become afraid of our very big emotions, that they're going to overwhelm us, that we're going to fall apart, that we're going to lose our shit. So I think that's part of it. Developing the willingness is kind of having this trust that by meeting them, you actually can release. That's where healing takes place. That's where movement takes place. In Chinese medicine, we talk about it as emotional hygiene, which is like, how do we deal with emotions? We don't get taught that. If you have really good role models in your life who are very healthy in their orientation and very present and engaged with reality, you see how to do that. But if you didn't have that, if you had people who were emotional terrorists or falling apart with anxiety or contracted in fear or not moving, not breathing, then that's your model for how to cope when emotions come. And I think we've said it on other episodes. Emotions are just energy, really, at their purest. So when you touch them, when you're warm with them, when you make space for them, it turns out they'll move. Mm-hmm. They're alive and they just move. So I think that's what you're getting at. And I myself do that as a practice. And really when I work with people, that's a lot of what you do. You just make space for it and you touch it. And then they realize that they have resiliency because it's like they're not falling apart, which is a lot of what almost like we have to do a certain measure of reality testing and see that we're not going to like be destroyed by heartbreak. I don't know. Did I ever tell you this story? Did I just even say this recently or not? I know I just was telling it to a friend going through heartbreak, but did I tell you the story about how when I was in therapy, I did. Okay. In the episode that you were saying you were sitting in bed with anxiety, with all these thoughts that weren't true. I think I was talking about how I used to want someone to tell me it was going to be okay.
Yeah.
Right. And I'd go to therapy and I want someone to tell me it's okay. And I realized the only thing we can know, like what real resilience is we can't know circumstances are going to be okay because no one can promise us that, I didn't expect Donald Trump to win as my president. It's not okay. So, you couldn't have promised me. Now you could say it's going to be okay after that, but when and how? It's not a really good promise to my system. But what you can tell me is I'm going to be okay. In other words, I'm going to be able to love again and laugh again and see magic in trees and like feel a breeze on my skin and like feel true to who I am and like be alive in my body. That I can say. I can really say that. So with that, I think with heartbreak, to have resilience so that you can open up your heart, which feels like the most vulnerable and risky endeavor because it's so painful when something gets taken from us. To do that, you need a certain amount of trust that you can be okay on the other side of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And that's where
like the story that we won't be okay if it happens again is just a story because it's like, here we are on the other side of whatever the last heartbreak was, which can sometimes be catastrophic. We've all had our catastrophic heartbreak, and here I am. Like, So it's just a story about, I would never be able to do that again, or it would be the end of the world, or my world has already ended. And it's like, really? You know, those things are really worth investigating, but we have to catch them first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think they're super culturally dominant. Like, as much as we love as a culture, we're also very much about like, be cool. Don't let anyone hurt you. You know, like, what are all those stupid books about the games that you're supposed to play with people?
Don't even.
The rules, right? Is that what it's
Here's
called?
how
Like
to manipulate someone into marrying you. Hooray!
God. Oh, here's how to pretend like you don't give a shit so you can attract sociopaths who don't want you to have the feeling. Like, I can't.
Nice.
There's so culturally, what does that say? You know, if we're developing all of these ways to guard yourself from being vulnerable, what we're saying is vulnerability is dangerous.
Yeah.
You know, and what I want to say to people is like, it's just heartbreak, people.
Yeah.
Now,
stay in bed for 3 days.
Gotten through it. Okay.
Right.
I say that having gotten through it. I didn't feel that way when when me and my ex-boyfriend were breaking up, and I had to pack all of my stuff out of his apartment, and I had to like call my besties to come and like literally carry me out because I was like crying too hard to move. I certainly wasn't like, it's just heartbreak.
But you let yourself do that. Like, that's what I was saying about stay in bed for 3 days. Do what you need to do. Like, lose your shit. Call your besties. Give them the heads up you're losing your shit. But lose your shit. You'll realize that it doesn't last forever. And you'll probably let some stuff out, you know?
Well, you'll realize you can survive it, which is a real amazing thing. Like, anytime you cry and you don't actually fall apart like you thought, or anytime you lose someone and your life isn't decimated, maybe something good even comes out of it. Like, when me and my ex went through our divorce, that was one of the most painful things I've ever gone through. He's such a significant person in my life. I mean, still is to this day. So that was like a real ripping away. And it was my first disillusionment, really, really, although I'd had my heart broken millions of times before, but this was different. And even in the midst of that, it's like I found myself. I found the ways that I was hiding behind my man. Truly, I found the ways that I was still operating from a compromise, like love equals compromise model. I actually discovered I was lovable, like in my breakup, because I had all this like narrative that I'm unlovable. But luckily, my ex and I managed to stay friends. And in that process, I realized he loves me, not because I'm doing anything for him. I'm not cooking for him. I'm not cleaning. I'm not providing. I'm not doing anything. And he loves me. So I had this great epiphany. So part of resilience is realizing I've already survived.
Yeah.
And that not only that, but in the grit, there are seeds of bliss and that they're all interconnected. Some of why I want to get back to the body for a second. One of my colleagues, Dr. Ann Jensen, who I adore, who does really brilliant work with people getting pain out of their body, always says, you know, the issues are in the tissues. Mm-hmm. And I feel like to a certain extent, what I notice for myself is that it's almost like all of these unprocessed, unmetabolized traumas and experiences and emotions that we store in our bodies. It's like they're vibrating, you know, like it's like almost like you stuffed a lot of people into a room. So the heat's coming from the room and there's like a lot of vibration. And so then it just takes a little hurt on top of it, like just a little bit. And your window of tolerance for your nervous system is already blown open. Yep. And you're going into a defense mode and you can't process it. It's like overload really quickly. So some of it is, I think that at some point in the past in our lives, we suffered heartbreak. Like we suffer lots and lots of heartbreaks being human and being in a civilization because we're enculturated. We're actually domesticated by people. Don't do this. Don't want that. Don't be like that. No, you can't. No, I love you for who I want you to be, not for who you are. All of these things are happening to all of us everywhere we go. So little heartbreaks, and then sometimes big heartbreaks, traumas, parents leaving you, abuses, deaths early on. And those things sit in our tissues if they haven't been met enough, if they haven't been met with tenderness and awareness, and they're stored, the angers, the hurts, the resentments, the fear gets stored. And then I think as we're meeting these new experiences, we can feel underneath like, holy shit, my capacity is almost full. Like I can't actually tolerate this. And that's not totally true on one level, like you were illuminating before. It's like they're really mostly just narratives, like because we have so much capacity as a human. Look at people who are in the biggest strife in the world, like people who are in countries that are war-torn, and they keep going. We have enormous capacity. But beyond that, don't you think that there's a piece where it's like you're almost sensing that your body is at capacity with how much tension it can keep?
Yes. And I think that that's true. And, what I would like to do is a little bit vomit up resources, because this is a tremendous passion of mine. Like I'm turning the steering wheel of all of my private practice towards this, because I think we're at a very, very, very exciting time in human history for understanding and healing trauma. We've never been here before. It's exceptionally good news. We used to think trauma just meant you're broken, you're forever fucked up, depending on how big the trauma was. And so there are a couple of books worth reading. One is The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And he does tremendous work in trauma via, a variety of embodied healing practices. And Peter Levine, Waking the Tiger, he was one of the very first people to connect like physiology and trauma responses. So those books are great places to start if you're listening to this and you're like, where do I start? And they will point you to a variety of, resources, because, I have, like for me personally, as somebody who has a history of trauma, history of PTSD, I have things that I do. I have somatic meditation practices, but sometimes the feeling is still too big for me alone in my house, sitting on my cushion. And so when that happens, and it happens, with some regularity, I go see my delightful office mate, Ellen Lenson, who does cranial sacral, is very helpful to me. Energy work's very helpful to me. I'm about to start investigating and probably training in trauma release exercises, TRE. So there are all these different things you can do. I do neurofeedback, lens neurofeedback. I'm saying these also that I wind up putting them in the show notes resources. So if everyone's listening and like, crap, I wish I had a pen, just go to the website. I'll put them in the resources. But there are so many, like, it's fucking exciting, guys. There's this huge revolution happening that can reboot your nervous system. Not in a way where it's like, the magic happy pill and everything goes away, but in a way where you have these processes you can engage with, where that feeling of I can't take it anymore, fullness in the nervous system that you're describing, Vanessa, can discharge, and that you can have regular practices and practitioners and places to go and be and things to do to keep discharging that, so that, what I find for myself is that the more I engage in those things, and at this point I've just discovered and that's a part of my lifelong path for me. I'll continue to engage in these things, and I hope in my life's work to bring this to more and more people in the world. That I have much more capacity in every category of my life, because I have literally discharged things in my nervous system. So I have more capacity for getting things accomplished in my work life. I have more capacity for not having a kitchen sink full of dishes. I have more capacity for being irritated with a family member or, whatever. So it just frees up a tremendous amount of space, so that when the big emotions come along, it doesn't feel like this awful, indigestible lump that you now need to contract against, pretend it's not happening, and just put a new layer of, cover up on top of things. So that's the end of my vomiting of resources, maybe, unless I think of some other ones. But it's exciting,
I'll try not to hold
and people
you to
should
that.
know that these things exist, because we're at the beginning of something here.
Well, think about it on a most fundamental level. The way that we meet life best is by breathing, right? Like that's the way we engage with life. if we want to have good sex, if we want to have connection, if we want to grieve, if we want to relate to the nature around us, it's all through breath. We breathe. I mean, that's the universal force. So when you've been contracted and in a state of defense, I mean, one of the first things that goes is your ability to breathe, like to actually take those deep, engaged breaths, right? Wouldn't you agree?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I love where you're going because we're talking about some really deep, fundamental work there. And it also occurred to me to add this. I guess there's a lot we can say on this, and I think maybe we need a separate episode on forgiveness.
Yeah, I was realizing that too. I thought we were going to go to forgiveness, but next time.
Yeah, it really
or
is
sometime.
this whole thing. Yeah. But okay, so when I broke up with one of my ex-boyfriends in the recent past, prior to my current marriage, there was a breakup. The breakup happened pretty shockingly. It was actually me who had initiated it at the time, but I didn't see it coming for myself. Like it was like just a moment where he said something and I realized we had a problem, like that. And I saw the writing on the wall and I broke up with him. So it happened like kind of fast, right? And it was devastating. In a way, it had like a more almost crippling sensation than my divorce did. And my divorce, talk about conscious uncoupling. Like we were very much engaged in a process together. There was a lot of lead time to it. We kind of went through it for a long time. I mean, that was really one of my prouder things, was that conscious uncoupling. But this was different. This felt like I was dying, like someone cut me deep. Mm-hmm. And Carolyn Myss, what would you call Carolyn Myss? The not energy worker, but she's like an energetic doctor.
There you go.
She has a more fancy title. But Carolyn Myss was saying something about how when you love someone, you cord with them. Mm-hmm. You create these like energetic pathways to them. And the image she gave for heartbreak was like, imagine like an umbilical cord going between the two of you. And that when something happens that's abrupt, it's like slicing through this live umbilical cord that has blood and like plasma and energy going back and forth between it. And it felt so apt for what I was feeling. It felt like I was bleeding out. Mm-hmm. And like almost the shock. I mean, I hate to give you guys this image, but if you've had heartbreak, you may relate to it. It was like this cord, kind of like a fire hose, like going left and right, just like shooting blood, was how it felt. And I couldn't eat and I couldn't sleep and, all of those kinds of things. And it was really interesting because it was in some ways more acutely severe than what I had gone through in my divorce. And my ex-husband was a much greater portion of my life. So I found that interesting and just starting to understand the energetics of it. Why is that essential? Because you have some fucking compassion for yourself.
Yeah.
It's really like, why am I saying this story? What did that do for me? I mean, I did a little energy work, which I love myself, just like you were saying. But some of it starts to put it into context because maybe we had touched on this on our grief episode. Culturally, it's so shaming if you have a fucking emotion.
Yeah.
It's so shaming if you grieve and if you feel like falling apart. Like it's embarrassing. Oh my God, what if my ex-boyfriend listens and he hears that my friends had to carry me out of his apartment? Like, I actually don't care. But that thought, these are the things that stay with us. We have to look cool. We have to look like we don't care, or we have to be strong, and someone who can keep it together. So having a little compassion for the fact that you're human and that loss is probably one of the bigger existential things that we'll deal with as we be human, as we want us to be human, we will deal with loss. And it's a real opening, I think, because it brings up like, what does everything mean? And what's it all about? Like, don't you find grief sometimes opens up these like larger existential questions for you?
Oh, absolutely. And it can bring all kinds of goodness into life too, which we've talked about.
It's so ripe. It just depends on where you go with it. But if you let yourself not turn away, as Reggie would say, like if you let yourself stay with it, there's all this potentiality in it, like ripeness for you to feel alive, Also just for you to like make space for some of this old psychological pain that's coming through. Because sometimes, I've dealt with people who are going through grief over the loss of a love affair, where really they were just finally processing the grief over the loss of a parent, for example.
Yeah. And I think that, I hope I'm not diverting too much at the end of a conversation, but I'm glad you brought up that example, the courting and how you felt, after that breakup versus your conscious uncoupling, divorce, because I think that I've had that experience too. Like I think about this one college boyfriend I had. I think about him now as like completely inconsequential. Like it was a college boyfriend, whatever. Like he wasn't some love of my life or whatever. But that breakup, like he broke up with me when I thought we were like at the height of our relationship. And it was a trauma. I was wrecked by that heartbreak, but not because he was like super special, because it was a trauma. You know what I mean? It was a shock to the system. Whereas, my divorce with my ex-husband, I don't know how conscious it was, but it was an uncoupling, and it was loving. Like we still have tremendous amount of affection for one another and a good relationship in each other's lives now. But it was this, process of taking apart the threads. So I think it's worth for people to think about that we don't necessarily need to correlate the giant feelings with the importance of the person, but it's about what's going on in our own systems. Breakups can be more or less traumatic depending on the circumstance, but it doesn't mean this person necessarily was the most important person to you.
Sure, because that narrative can spin out the grief, right? Because now I've lost the most important person to me.
And then you can wind up in a situation where now you're coded to go look for someone like that person because you need to kind of plug back in, and you wind up with somebody who maybe just brings up a lot of like big adrenaline feelings, but not necessarily somebody who is like a good, nourishing partner for you. So we have to feel our feelings, but we need to kind of see them with a little distance too. Not take them as like, if I feel this horrible after this breakup, this means that I just lost the love of my life. It's like, really? No, it means that you're devastated. Why are you devastated?
And maybe I can say this at the end. This one's a hard one to wrap up because there's so much more I actually want to say on it now that we're going. But I think that we are meant as humans to survive heartbreak. I mean, that seems clear to me because it's part of life, because we're always going to lose people we love. That's what mortality is about, right? So we must have been created to survive heartbreak. So, and I know I have, and I believe that to be a fact. I didn't know that when I was younger. If I thought about, let's say, my parents dying, I thought, put me in a mental hospital. And now I think it is going to be horrible, but of course I'll survive. I really believe in resiliency because I have it. But I think humans are made to survive heartbreak. What I don't think we're really made to do is to survive heartbreak alone.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of our larger cultural dilemmas, is that we're so alone in it. We're often really alone. We don't have this kind of tribal container that brings us together. And also many of us, like for me, I just had learned self-reliance early on in my life for, my own reasons. So then when I was going through my divorce, I just honestly didn't know how to talk to people when I was in the midst of grieving.
Yeah.
It was like later, but not while I was falling apart. I didn't want to burden people. I didn't want to be too much. My own self-reliance was kind of keeping me in this prison of not reaching out and getting support. I had kind of loosened those restrictions by the time I went through my next breakup. So I was able to receive the nourishment of having, in that moment, a tribe of women around me, which was so glorious. I mean, I had male friends too, which are wonderful, but like something about a tribe of women when you're grieving is wonderful. And so what I would encourage is, if you're going through heartbreak, or if you go through heartbreak sometime soon, it's like, we're wired to handle pain. We really, really are. But we are not wired to be alone in it, I don't think.
Agreed.
Thanks for listening to today's show. The show notes, including any resources we mentioned in the episode, live at blissandgrit.com. Just go ahead on over to the website and scroll down, and you'll see each episode's separate post, and we put the resources right in there. can also come play with us on social media. Instagram and Facebook are really where we're most available. And we're Bliss and Grit at both of those spots. It's been really fun to hear from some of you and engage in the conversation, so thanks for showing up. If you want to support the show, you can write us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or on our Facebook page, which is Bliss and Grit. We love hearing from all of you, and it also helps other people find the show. If technology isn't your thing, but you are enjoying the show, well then just please tell your friends you think it might resonate with. Huge bit of gratitude to all of you who have already written reviews. So heartwarming. And I want to take a minute to read one by Kelly Bryant Yoga. Brooke and Vanessa bring the perfect combination of thorough, studious book smarts and kind, loving understanding to all of the complex topics they discuss. This podcast is routinely the inspiration for my pre-class Dharma talks because it helps me understand myself and the world around me with greater clarity. Thank you, ladies. Well, thank you, Kelly. And thanks to all of you for listening. And thanks for everyone who left a review. We're loving doing this so much, and we really have so much gratitude. One last thing. We have a new subscribe form on the website if you haven't seen that, which is blissandgrit.com. And you can go ahead in there and you can sign up in case you want to stay in touch with some of the events and goodies we have brewing for the community. Okay, thanks so much. And we'll be back next week.